All right, so I'm going to call the policy committee meeting to order. Today is Wednesday, April 28th, 2021, and it is 6 p.m. My name is Roberto Rodriguez. I'm chair of the committee. Before I go over the agenda, I'm getting in the habit of doing a quick round of introductions at the beginning of the meeting. So if we can just give us our name, our title, and then pass it on to the next person. Mr. Irish, if you don't mind starting, go for it.
Hi, Jeff Irish, District 5. I'll pass it on to Aura.
Hi, I'm Aura Russell Better, and I'm school board member from District 4. How about Aaron?
Good evening. I'm Aaron Townsend, Assistant Superintendent of School Management and PPS staff for the Policy Committee. Jake, would you?
I am Jake Eastman, Interim Principal of Remote Academy. I'll pass it to Ann.
Hi, I'm Ann Rothaker. I'm the Board Secretary, and I'll pass it off to Emily.
I wonder if Emily's not right in front of her computer this moment. So I'll take the floor back.
I'm here. I'm here. Sorry.
Emily, go ahead. I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Oh, I have a bad connection. I'm going to fix my connection, but first, I'm Emily Figdor. Oh, sorry. I have a bad connection. I'm Emily Figdor. I'm the District 2 representative on the school board and the board chair.
Great. Thank you, Emily. So quick, tonight, we're going to, on our agenda, we're going to approve our minutes from the last meeting. Then after that, we're going to look at the discipline policies and take a vote to advance them to the full board for their review and talk a little bit about that process. Then we'll continue our discussion on the law enforcement policy revisions and start to talk about the next steps and some of the guiding principles that we'll use from the community's discussion. And then that should be the end of our meeting. We'll adjourn after that. So we'll start with approving our minutes. Oh, did we lose Mr. Irish?
Yep.
Let me see. Oh, he did text me. Oh, it looks like he's having connection issues as well, like Chair Figdor. Let's, because we would need a second and the vote for the minutes, maybe why don't we just postpone that until Mr. Irish is back here? So we'll put that off to the side, and then we'll move on then to the revision of discipline policies item. Should I pass it on to Aaron?
Yep, that'd be great. As we talked about at the last meeting, so one piece, and hopefully Mr. Irish will rejoin us too in just a moment, but we've certainly been working steadily on this work around the discipline policies. So thanks to all the committee members around the engagement. Obviously, thanks to Dr. Giesman for his leadership in this work. I'll give you a moment in just a sec to just update us on any of those last, if there were tweaks from the last meeting at all. But we kind of have things. Here we go. Pause. Welcome back, Jeff. We just beginning kind of the intro around the discipline policies. We'll come back and do minutes in just a moment, Jeff. So didn't miss anything of substance yet. So kind of coming out of last time, we have, kind of set up the, the summary of the policies, kind of the table that lists kind of at a high level the changes to each, and then provides the links to the, the current versions of the policies and then the proposed revisions. Again, because these have gone through so many substantive revisions, it's not manageable to kind of produce a, red line version of them because they are so dramatically different as we have with some other policy work. But you have kind of the current ones and then the proposed revisions. So that's kind of what we have in front of you tonight. Ideally, as we've talked about, for kind of action in terms of recommendation to move to the board level for that process, which, at the board process, when we talk about that, would look like a first read and then workshop, which we would be prepared to do at the coming meeting on Tuesday, and then second read and ideally adoption at the subsequent committee meeting. So that's kind of where we stand. Let me give so two things just to speak to before, or just Jake, Jake, and appreciations to Jake and Ann for helping to kind of pull these pieces together. Anything you guys want to share with the committee around, any updates or anything relevant to share at this point before we move forward?
Again, we've gone through so many iterations, I'm not remembering exactly which revisions we instigated after the last meeting, but I remember they were minor. One of them was defining firearm and aligning the weapons violence and school safety policy more with existing code. And we decided not to do a final read on the suspension of students policy pending discussion of elementary suspension.
Yeah, that was the main kind of, I think, proposed additional revision around the weapons policy was that one. So that's in there and reflected. And Anne, I didn't know if you had any comments.
No, nothing else.
Thank you. The one other thing I wanted to flag just before we move to discussion was, one of the asks from Mr. Irish was around some data around the types of incidents, because we'd shared data around just the number of suspensions, both in school and out of school suspensions, by school. And so there'd been an ask for data around, in the discussion around the weapons policy. So that's there. I shared that, with members via email earlier, but it's also in the board packet. It's not broken down at this juncture by school. We can continue to do more of that, but has just kind of a volume of incidents. So just wanted to, share that, see if there are any clarifying questions or anything that might prompt for discussion before we move forward towards action for this evening.
I don't see any hands raised. I was just asked, what kind of disaggregated data are we looking to get from those numbers? I know schools you mentioned. Anything else that we can break them down into? With the other discipline data that we've seen has always been requested to be broken down by racial groups and also by if there's special education, ELL students, and any other special class.
Yeah, we can do those similar, kind of profiles. All that data is all lives within IC. So that can continue to happen.
Very small numbers in some of those categories, so it will be hard to, you're going to get a lot of asterisks.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, whatever we can find, I think, to add more context to the numbers. Any other questions from committee members? I would just say, just to remind everyone, the summary that's in the package, it reflects the summary of the changes, and literally what Dr. Giesman just shared with us is what you would find in that summary. So it's a really helpful quick glance at what's in the package.
And I just to offer it just in terms of, and not presuming our next step here, but just, how I'm envisioning kind of like the workshop presentation would, obviously all these materials, but then would have a, kind of PowerPoint deck that talked a little bit about process we've been engaged in, as well as kind of summarized with a little bit more, particularly for, kind of the foundational policies as we positioned them, like JIC and, JK, the like student code of conduct and the student discipline policy, a little bit more substance to those around what those changes were. So I would imagine kind of doing an overview, particularly around those two, and then hitting on the other policies, some of which didn't have as much substantive revision, but speaking to that. So that's what I'm envisioning in terms of the PowerPoint deck that would kind of roll things out for the workshop.
Yeah, if we can, and I assume that this would be part of it, if we can highlight, the groups that were involved in the discussions and the revisions, because there was so much time that was put into that. You know, I want to recognize Jake's effort into that. I just randomly would see him in meetings that I'm joining, and there he is, you know, talking about the discipline policy. And so I know that it was purposeful that we gathered input from people. So make sure that that's demonstrated in our presentations. Yep. Great. So, do we have? Is this? Are we at the point where the committee can take action on the full package, or do we have anything else? All right.
No, from our end. Yep.
Okay. So, just to quickly summarize, our vote right now is a procedural vote to pass all of these policies to the full board for that first read. So, I would entertain a motion to consider, I would entertain a motion for consideration and action to approve the revisions to the discipline policies. Is there a motion?
Moved.
By Ms. Russell Better. And Jeff, you're off camera, but if you can unmute yourself, we can hear you.
Seconded.
All right, and we've got a second. Are there any questions on the motion? I don't see any questions. We don't have any attendees, so we can skip over public comment. Any further discussion about the motion? As I said a moment ago, I'm incredibly grateful for all the work that went into this, and I'm looking forward to hearing the full board discussion. This has been, you know, discipline issues or discipline policies has been at the forefront of so many discussions that we've had. So I'm excited to have the full board chime in on these and also for them to see the process that we've taken. So it's a pivotal point for this, and I couldn't be prouder to be part of the committee. So we'll take a vote. All those in favor, please indicate. And Ms. Irish, since you're not,
Aye.
There you go. Ms. Russell Better,
Yes.
and I'll take a yes as well. That's unanimous. With the support of the full committee. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. All right, let's move on to our next agenda item. This is a discussion on the law enforcement policy revisions framework. And I understand Superintendent Botana is going to, okay, so I'll hand it off to Javier. Go ahead.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening. What we wanted to do today in this discussion is to ideally begin to frame a set of principles that we can then use for drafting the revisions to the policies that are related to law enforcement. So in the packet tonight, what you have are, you've seen before, all of these documents, the actual policies involving police, the, multiple policies that we currently have with just a thumbnail description of what is in each of those policies. And then you also have the some of those policies we actually are already addressing as part of the discipline policy, by the way. So, and then you also have in the packet the notes from the safety dialogue that the committee hosted, back in January with multiple groups and the survey form that followed from the actual dialogue. So that's what's in the packet today. So I think the first thing that we wanted to do is to give the committee an opportunity to sort of debrief. I know that you started a conversation on this at a prior meeting, but we thought today that it would be helpful to spend a little bit of time on that. Then we're prepared to sort of walk through an exercise that we went through as a team with, Aaron and Jake and Abdullahi Ahmed a couple of weeks ago as we were preparing for this as a way to sort of hopefully frame a way of thinking about those the multiple instances in which students could come in contact with the police in a school setting, and then, sort of take any questions and comments and thoughts from you around that. And then we really want to begin the process tonight of trying to arrive at some general principles of what might be the way that we think about the interactions of our students with the police while they are, in our care in schools. So that's kind of the way that we're thinking about tonight. So I don't know, Aaron, if you want to add anything to that, or if there are any clarifying questions after Aaron does any additional framing. And then if not, I will move on to the first part of our protocol for tonight.
Yeah, no additional framing. I mean, I know we took some time at a couple meetings ago for folks to do an initial read, and hopefully folks have had time to kind of peruse that feedback so we can just jump into the discussion there.
Yeah.
Seems right. Let's move on.
Okay. Mr. Irish, Ms. Russell-Better, any questions you may have? No. Okay. All right, so then let's move into the notes from the safety dialogue, and just as Aaron said, you've had these for a couple of months. I know that you've started a discussion about them. So rather than sort of spending the time reading them, obviously the first few pages are the ones that summarize the overall discussion. So it might be helpful for you to ground yourself in those. And then I'm just going to open it up to you to sort of give us your reflections and your takeaways from this discussion, based on your read of the notes then and the comments that you heard that night, and so on. Anytime somebody wants to jump in, this is your time.
Yeah, so we can, there's any, like Javier said, anyone who wants to start, go ahead. I don't have anything in particular to like kind of kick it off. Yeah.
I can just, unfortunately I didn't in the last, recent days go over it enough, so it's a little not fresh in my mind, but just glancing at it right now, I'm remembering just, I'm sure this is a big part of what we have to frame and define, but I'm remembering this coming up a lot, is just that, what is safety, right? Like, what is the definition of safety? Because that can be, a pretty subjective thing for people, and your own experiences, and what it may be to someone in school setting. It may look really differently for someone else to feel safe. So I guess that's just, to me, something that, I think in making any decisions, I think there's like having to come up with some common definition of what does that mean. And maybe that does have pieces of different people's perspectives, but I think that's just something that has stuck with me as a important piece.
Yeah, I think that, as I look through the summary, and I've done it several times, like different iterations, almost to see if when you watch the same movie more than once and you see different scenes. So I find that I start to highlight different themes that emerge. that I think then we apply into our policies. One of them is, only involve police, when there's absolutely no other alternative. And that's a very kind of like, hands-off interaction between the police and the schools, right? Like I said, like there's no other alternative. And then there's also a theme of there's some sort of responsibility to fix relationships between community members who don't have trust with the police. So there's that theme as well, which sort of kind of lays some sort of responsibility for the relationship through our policies. And then the last part is more of a kind of like revisit, a more active role of the school, of the police, almost like I don't want to say that there's a theme of bringing back the SROs, but there's more of the we lost, replacing whatever we lost from the SROs team. So those three things are the emerging themes that might through as I review it come out. In terms of our policy, I think that I reflect more of the conversations that we've had around the SRO. So it's the board has spoken somewhere definitively on that part. So yeah, that's I don't know if that's helpful, but that's kind of my takeaways as I read through them.
So what was your second one again? Did you capture that, Anne?
Rekindling the relationship between community members that don't trust law enforcement and the schools department's responsibility to help, fix those relationships or address the lack of trust. And again, this is what I'm getting from the documents.
Yeah, that's helpful. Mr. Irish, any?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was talking without. I have low bandwidth, so I'm trying to. I would piggyback off a little bit what Roberto just mentioned, and that it remains a contentious issue, and both of those sides for which he just brought up are going to present themselves again as we draw through this process. I will say that the process, and just kudos to all of those who participated. I thought the process was, as you read the difference in what was mentioned with respect to law enforcement. I know we're not trying to get back SROs into school, but to kind of get a community feel about how people view law enforcement in schools was very helpful. And I thought the process itself, the feedback as a result of the process was invaluable. So thank you. I think it was Aaron who set that up. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Anne, can I share my screen? Is that?
Javier, can I interrupt for a second? Do you want any more feedback? Or do you want to move on?
Oh no, absolutely. I thought you were
Yeah,
done.
I just, thought of something else, sort of in connection to this safety piece I said, but I just, if it's okay to just throw it out, it's not too in depth, but I just was struck with a couple of the groups that came up about, what going on with what does safety mean? Just that conversation about adults you trust that you can go to, right? Like I felt like that came up. And then I think like that idea of some people thinking safety has to be first and then relationship, but then maybe that idea of actually like, is safety having relationship, so maybe just kind of examining that because I feel like there's something there about safety really being from relationship, but maybe just the different ideas about what safety is. So kind of back to my original, but that was just a little more detail. And then I just wanted to throw out that, de-escalation training. Like, does everybody need, what is the need for skills for staff to feel, and just some of the language about multiple different ways to have creative responses to situations that may before have been an SRO response. But so that was just the other piece I wanted to share.
Yeah.
Just before you transition to that, two things. One, want to welcome Dr. Ahmed. So thanks for joining us this evening, Dr. Ahmed. And, from what you're going to share, just whenever we transition to the next thing, I have uploaded kind of like an image of, this activity that we've done to the packet now. So we can share, but it's also now added to the packet. So folks can look at it that way also.
So am I sharing, Anne? Good to go?
You are able to share, you're not sharing yet.
Okay, yeah, no. I have to do my part. So those of who've been on the board for a while know that I'm particularly partial to this, this approach to sort of breaking things into quadrants. And we, as we were trying to frame what are the contexts in which students interact with the police in school settings, we found it helpful to try to think about it on these continuums that are, sort of from on the horizontal plane from left to right, where there is no danger to the community to where there is danger to the community. And then from, north to south, where it's the impact of having an interaction is likely to be harmful to the student, to where it's likely to be beneficial to the student. So, and then what we tried to do, and we were fortunate to have Dr. Giesman as principal of the Remote Academy bring some new tools to our ability to do this online. And so we actually did a similar activity to what you've seen us do before with Post-it notes, but instead we used the Jamboard in order to be able to do this. And so we identified a set of activities, and those are, the Post-it notes, and, tried to place them in these quadrants in a way that was, sort of, and you see there's a number of them that sit on the planes. Those are places where we weren't really clear if they were things that could, they could be on one side of the quadrant or the other. And, so they're more of value judgments. Let me preface it by saying that I think all of these have a significant amount of, sort of our perspectives, our individual perspectives as we did this, work. But, what I'm going to walk through is, sort of at a high level where we think the real sort of, the challenge is for us as a policymaking set of people, right? And that's going to be over here in this particular quadrant. And so these are places where the community is not in danger, and this is, again, value, right? So, some people may have different perspectives on that, and likely harmful to student. And I think likely harmful to student from our perspective meant that the student was going to be in the juvenile justice system as a result of that interaction. At what level, at what, degree of, trouble would vary, but that they would have what was in all likelihood a interaction that would, result in some form of, coercive relationship with the police. So in this corner here, down at the bottom, is another place where we think it's important to spend a little bit of our time, because this is where I think one of the themes that came out of the community engagement on this, and I think that Roberto, you mentioned this, is the sort of where is there an obligation or an opportunity for the school system to be a place where students see the police in a pro-social, proactive, positive way, where they can provide interactions that are likely beneficial to students. And, clearly there aren't very many where there's danger to the community and that, there is a likely benefit to the student. If you think about the student as the student who is, not all students or the student body or something along those lines, then obviously there are many instances where, if the community is in danger and the police come to do something, that obviously is a benefit to all students, but it would likely not be beneficial to the student who was engaged in that activity. So, these are, fairly straightforward. So things like, doing research on policing. We've had over the years a number of students who have been engaged in, in research projects about the police or being involved in activities with police officers that were, positive ones, and mentoring relationships, things along those lines. Also places where, through the communication with school social workers and things along those lines, there's an understanding of a student who's being groomed or trafficked in some way, and where the police engages in a way that's likely beneficial to the student. And you see that we have truant in a place that is sort of splitting the two. And, I don't know exactly if it's more to the bottom than to the top because we didn't have room at the top, or because, we think that it's a little bit, but, obviously anything that is on those lines is places where we weren't 100% clear whether it belonged in one place or the other. So you can see some of those, activities that are the ones that we think are most problematic, and where our goal for tonight, as you articulate and begin to articulate, I don't know that we're going to get this done tonight, but if you begin to articulate some principles for how we interact with the police, they're probably mostly governing the extent to which we are comfortable with these, with the police being engaged in these particular instances. So just one last thing, the pink was, again, just, it's a way for us to show that these are places where, in all likelihood, the police are key participants and actors. So they are actually places where, the police will definitely be involved in order for that activity to take place. We don't do anything with a warrant. We, immediately outsource to police if there is a firearm involved in things along those lines. So, so these are, those are the ones that we highlighted in pink. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to just sort of look through those, and then, ask any clarifying questions, ask any, if you don't know what we meant for any particular one, or we have initials or things along those lines that you're not familiar with. But just give you a few minutes.
And if we can use the raise your hand feature, that way I'll pull up the list of panelists and be on the lookout since we're sharing screens. I've been waiting to ask if you can explain the on the upper left quadrant, those sports events, and there's a school dance. I'm assuming that's just you have for sports events that you have police at the end, in the park. I'm just wondering why it's in the likely harmful to students area.
The purpose for their being there is to, sort of maintain order. And so as a result of that, any student who is disorderly in any range of what is disorderly could potentially have a negative interaction with the police.
Ms. Russell-Better?
Well, thank you, Chair. So just curious about the school dance part. Is just by norm, is there a police officer there, or what's the?
It's it's generally something that we do in, when there is a school dance, just as a way of, to make sure that things don't get out of hand. And so that's traditionally been, and it's the same as the sporting events.
So for both middle school and high school?
Well, I'll speak for Lemon Moore. There was a tradition when I got there of having one, and the current principal eliminated that tradition. So I can't speak for all the other schools.
So it's maybe by school, but definitely high school, that's probably the norm. And okay, thanks.
Ms. Irish?
Just to follow up on that, sports events and dances, I assume the presence of security at some point historically was born out of necessity, or was that just a long-standing go-to in those events? I know that Javier just mentioned that a potentially disorderly experience at either one of those two events might involve a negative interaction with law enforcement. So who would be there, or what would be the fallback? And as in a teacher or a staff member would be responsible for any kind of disorderly conduct, potentially, let's just say there's a fight.
Yeah.
And in the event that law enforcement is not there, I assume a phone call would be made, but is there anyone on site that would be responsible for that kind of engagement with the students?
The school staff in the way, I think that Jake's example is illustrative of that. There's, there was a tradition to have a police officer there. To your point, probably necessitated, started because there was a incident at some point that, required the, referral to the police. And then it just became a matter of let's just have the police there just in case there is a situation. And, so they stopped it. And, dances continued. I'm sure that, monkey business continued to happen at, school dances, and Jake and Ben and whoever else was in a chaperone role, dealt with it, including fights, which, happen in schools every day, in middle schools that don't have SROs, in schools that have SROs, but the SRO is doing something else, and, the principal or whoever is supervising the lunchroom engages in it.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, and Aaron, I know you got your hand up, but I just wanted to, so let's just take school dances away from it, and let's take sporting events that happen perhaps on-site, Lyseth Lincoln, or Lyseth or Lyman, or events that happen at the Expo or at Fitzpatrick. I would assume that we don't have staff, teachers or otherwise, there to monitor disorderly behavior.
Well, that was what I wanted to weigh in on, just the one exception. So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The perfect follow-up your follow-up question, it answers it specifically, which is at the larger events at the Expo and some of those public events at Deering, there is event staff that through the city that supports security. So this is not uniformed police, but additional event staff that helps manage the events and provide support and security there. So that's those larger events. That's true. In addition to the athletic directors, right, and generally speaking, the administrators being on site as well. So in those more public sporting events, that's only true, at things like at the Expo or FITSE or Memorial, right, where there's some of that additional city staff. That's not, for a cross country meet at wherever, Riverside, that's not the case because it hasn't been needed, right? But at those larger events, there is that additional kind of support that's there.
I appreciate the clarification, and I think the idea of having law enforcement at a dance is kind of silly, but so I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Where do school dances usually take place? Is it like at the gym in each building? Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
Types of the prom happens sometimes outside of the building, but the dances happen at the gym.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, when I was certainly in high school, our school was so large. We never have those sorts of events would always take place at a venue. But clearly here, there's smaller events that we can fit into schools. I don't see Jeff. I'm assuming is up from earlier.
I did raise my hand one more time because I just wanted perhaps Javier can fill me on some of the legal ramifications with respect to the JCCOs and probation violations. I see that they're up on the top left. Could you provide some clarification on how that might be harmful to a student in a school environment who might be on otherwise legal obligations with respect to being released back into the community under those circumstances?
I mean, just those things are not our core, they're not our core responsibilities as a school. And so, to the extent that a student is losing class time or, feeling that school is a place where he interacts with, his JCCO, that's why it's in that quadrant.
And I understand that. I think the disruption in education and the fact that it has to happen in a school environment is probably disruptive, but I would hate to envision that all or any and all interactions with the JCCO is perhaps negative, but I understand the disruption in school might be.
I mean, it's born out of a negative interaction with law enforcement, right? They're in the juvenile justice system.
And I understand that, and for some reasons necessary.
I mean, I might offer just and I think there's some distinction of why does the check-in have to happen? A check-in, for example, have to happen at school. We have had instances where that then leads to a student arrest. So thus then their level of, our perspective on why that's harmful for the student in terms of our relationship with the students then makes us aligned with them to perceive us, right, as aiding and abetting in the, in that in that mechanism, right? And certainly they need to do their check-ins and follow through, right? That work needs to happen, but I think it's raising the question of like, does that need to happen? And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be furnishing them with updates, that there is a role, and we've seen positive roles that JCCOs can play in helping to support and counsel and guide students. So it doesn't mean that there isn't communication about, all the, attendance and grades and things like that, we're generally required to provide, and often can provide a useful benefit to students. But I think it really comes down to like, wait, a student's coming to school, right? And we want to continue to promote that and have that relationship and build trust around that to be able to support them. So I think that's, there's
Aaron, I completely understand what you're saying. I would really hope that the Department of Corrections would not run into a school with a JCCO to have a negative interaction unless it was absolutely necessary. So I hope to the extent that happens, it's small enough to where it's barely on the radar, but I don't have the stats behind that.
I think each of these sticky notes, we might each put them somewhere different on the spatial array here. So I think it's helpful to interrogate individual examples to kind of flesh things out. But I think part of the intent of the exercise is to see if we can come to some general principles that might guide the policy review. So for instance, obviously police involvement or law enforcement involvement is necessary when it's legally mandated. That must be one of the principles. There may be a principle to avoid it when there's no danger to the community and no clear benefit to the student, that kind of thing. So just to alleviate anybody's fear that they need to put a stake in the ground on where any of these sticky notes lands.
I think that's very helpful, Jake. I do, I think that is exactly what this is intending to elicit is, to sort of guide you in thinking about, in instances where there is a danger to the community, those are instances where the school district would be, well served by actually engaging the police. In those cases where the community is not in an imminent danger, what are the guideposts that we want to place for engaging the police? Are there places where, because of the benefit that accrues to students from it, we want to encourage police involvement in our schools? Those are the kinds of things that, in my mind, flow from this distribution and this the sort of the quadrants.
Thank you, and I agree, Jake. That was really helpful framing. Should we? Jeff, unless you have another follow-up, we can move to Russell, to Ms. Russell Better.
No, I'm good. I apologize to the group for the rant. I just had some clarifications.
No, very helpful actually, and again, it landed us on a good framing of what we should be doing.
No, yeah. Please, the floor is yours.
And by the way,
and it's helpful to just build on.
I apologize for that.
Oh. Can't hear you now, Roberto. Okay, Charles, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just saying that I'm off camera because I'm trying to sneak in dinner. I have to eat at this start.
Okay. No, it's helpful too, Jeff, because then your question adds to something else and then adds to my question. So I really would love some clarification about JCCO even coming into school. So for me, I didn't know that was happening. So is that like a by situation request? Are there regular check-ins being done with students? Like I just don't have an understanding of what that looks like right now.
So I can speak from the field that, going into that position, AP at Lyman Moore without any guideposts, I actually did have relationships with the JCCOs and was in contact with them about shared students, and they would ask to come have their check-ins at the building. And, I think a lot of times it was positive, but I wasn't thinking about possible negative impacts. And so, but definitely, at least at Lyman Moore, the JCCOs, they would even come in, have, lunch with kids who were interested in hanging out with them, who weren't on their client load or whatever it's called, caseload.
And Dr. Ahmed, do you have a
the same
policy or
Yeah, it is the same case. The practice, the JCCO, there are two, and they follow alphabetical order, like A to L and M to Z. And they used to come to the school and meet with the students. And at times, because in the high school, perhaps it may be a context or the age group, but it's not mainly like eating lunch with the students, but it's more about checking on them and, I need their attendance, I need their grades, and at times we just more invasive kind of like scrutiny of like, drug testing students and saying like go to the bathroom and just, so that's to some extreme. And in rare occasions, it happened that students were, at least, it's not a lot, but it happened that students were taken from the school because of they violated their curfew, or they violated their whatever conditions they were on. So that happened. That's what happens as well, but not a lot of.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's helpful because that to me, I just like superintendent said, like my concern is that that's not, school's purview. It's for us to have a safe place for students. And if that gives opportunity for that, that is a disruption in students' education. And I guess just going back to the sticky notes, and I know Jake kind of mentioned this, that there's already kind of a framework there, but I guess some of the questions I would ask about having a JCCO in the building is like, is it necessary? Is it a last resort? If we're talking about the law enforcement being involved, is it a last resort? Is it necessary? And is it potentially harmful? And I would think like that circumstance Dr. Ahmed just said is potentially no to those, or yes to the potentially harmful. So I guess those are just, I know the language is already there, but I guess like, in you explaining that circumstance, that sounds to me like there's a lot of question of whether that's something we want to have as okay in our school building. So I guess that's just my thinking.
And so just to sort of then bring that back into the policymaking arena, we have one of our policies, which is KI, the visitors to the school, that governs that in, to a certain extent now, that would, depending on where we wind up with our principles around that, could be strengthened to make, for opportunities to share data with the JCCO, but to limit their access to the building for the purposes of sort of just routine check-ins and things along those lines, or put guidelines around parental permission and things along those lines that govern that. So I think that's the next level of work, that I think our goal is to sort of lay out what are some of these principles that then we can use to rewrite policies to conform to those big ideas.
I'd hasten to, I was just going to add to that I think that if we redefine the rules of engagement with law enforcement through board policy such that it's limiting some, removing some existing interactions that we have with law enforcement, I don't think that has to be antagonistic to law enforcement. I just want to hasten to add that I think the rules of engagement can change and there can still be positive relationships between the entities. But maybe just safer for kids.
So I was just going to add what the superintendent said, and then what you said, Jake, is that, that there's subtleties too, right? Of course, if voluntarily a student feels it's a positive relationship, then that would be a different case, right? If it was a check-in that a student felt was being done that was beneficial to them, as opposed to it being something mandated and that it feels like maybe they're trying to find something, right? That just feels like a completely different context. So I guess just to say that, that like Javier said, the parent giving permission and all these other pieces seem like they would be important to have just hammered out. So
that maybe is reflected in that there's a sticky that says needs mentorship, just as an example of that. And right, there's could codify some procedure around that potentially, or suggest that.
And generally, when we express that the educational or benefit to the student is often the not outsourcing, but it feels like we are from the school side or from that saying like the JCCO or the law enforcement can do this and we cannot do it because it's last resort. So I see that at times also we tend to go for a last resort, like the JCCO will help us, engage these students, or will be another partner to help us engage these students, which is the only tool that they have is like, if you don't do it, you will go back to Long Creek, or you'll have more conditions on you. So it's not like, a lot of other different supports. It's like really that fear that the students are scared that they may get more trouble with them, which is at times works for some students, but not necessarily for all the students.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Can I just say, so as I'm looking at like the superintendent said, this upper left quadrant is where we should probably spend most of our time. I'm looking at different reasons or different categories of reasons. So one would be, reactionary, right? Like has a joint, we have to respond. Things like the sporting event and the school are more preventative. So I think like drawing that distinction for me, it sounded to me like preventative, although we acknowledge that in the past there might have been a need. We've heard Lyman Moore had a change in what they did with their sporting events. We might have different thoughts about what a school dance, what preventative measures we want to take, particularly if staff were there. So those preventative issues seem to be easy. I feel like we have clarity on those to some degree, and we don't feel very strongly that police need to be there. On the reactionary stuff, I want to say, and I couldn't stop, like the has a joint, just you guys put it like on a bigger font or like a bigger, so I couldn't stop looking at it. So I'm wondering, what is the common reaction from administrators, teachers, when you find a kid with a joint or a bag of weed or something like how do we address that? I agree. By the way, the likely harmful to student, I appreciate that is there because it could increase the chances that he is involved with. I keep saying, I'm sorry that I'm adding gender to my comments, that they are involved in law enforcement. But I also think that there's a health risk here, right? Like we know that young folks smoking weed we know that developmentally that's not a good thing for them. So there's a double kind of health or harmful part to the students. So anyways, how do we generally address that in our schools?
Well, I would say, we have, just back to the discipline policies and frankly, this would be something, that we had said for this committee to come back to kind of the work we did around the tobacco and vaping policy. There's work that we likely should apply to the, I'm not going to remember the right policy acronym around it, but the substance use policy. But, we have internal school discipline, on the one hand, we have internal school discipline procedures that we can apply, right, to address that, as well as like treatment and intervention resources, which was the kinds of things we layered into the, tobacco and vaping policy. And that's our domain, right, to manage those issues. And so those are the, the various tools we would utilize to address those issues and provide students the kind of needed support, to the kind of health impacts that you're naming there, right? To be able to provide more healthful diversions and alternatives versus treating it as a criminal justice issue, right? So I think that's the potential for the, within the context of this law enforcement conversation, it's like, do we treat this as like a criminal justice issue or this as, violating some school norms? Because certainly it's, any of our, kind of rules should be, it's, inappropriate to have that at school, and have procedures to deal with that both, treat the violation of those norms, right, and provide student appropriate resources. So, Jake or Dr. Ahmed, do you want to share anything?
It's only happened to me once in 6 years, so I'll defer to Dr. Ahmed.
Yeah, using the school policy and also treating students as not as, one group but going to the unit level. There are kids who will come to my office under the influence, say like, I have a problem with this. I don't know how to get off this. So Nurse Nelly or Bob Carroll or Melissa McSay will be helping that kid rather than or a kid who selling it and have you're not treating them the same way. So how to just go to case by case and really go to the root cause of this and work with the kids and the educational piece of also, like Mr. Rodriguez, you mentioned about vaping, and so controlling and monitoring students and trying to prevent it that way may not only be the only method, but also educational process where in the health class or in visuals or talking about this, bringing guest speakers, talking about educating students about vaping and others, to empower them and give them the tools that they need and also support them. And the accountability comes the last when it comes to the treating the substance use.
But I just want to sort of ground us in what the actual policy says, so that's why I pulled it up. And I think, are you seeing it on the screen now?
It's smaller.
This is what the policy says. Any violation of the terms of the policy shall constitute sufficient grounds for student discipline, including suspension or expulsion from school at the appropriate discretion of the administrator and the board. The school resource officer or other appropriate law enforcement authority shall also be notified of this policy. So strict adherence to the current policy would call for the joint to be a report to the school resource officer or, or other law enforcement.
Yeah. So here's one of those reactionary instances where the policy, I would say that, we only heard from Dr. Ahmed right now, and unfortunately, Jake has only had a limited experience. But I would say that I'd love to hear what the experiences have been, what the practices are. I'm assuming that, I'm assuming that we're not calling the police every time that we find a student has weed, as the policy says. So I would say that reaction to call the police, as the policy says, is probably something that I feel will probably need to be changed. So that's a good example of something that's in that upper left quadrant. Ms. Victor, if you want to go ahead and chime in, and then we'll go to Cyrus.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate this conversation and particularly the exercise with the quadrants, and I've just been listening in. But the Chair's discussion about different categories, I think, underscoring this exercise with the quadrants, and just to say it, to make it explicit, is that as a district, as a city, as a larger society, we have not had clarity in the role of law enforcement, and we've allowed, law enforcement has taken on kind of many roles outside of kind of I think what could be a very more narrow definition, and so one thing I want to just always have in mind is, because we did something in the past is not reason we should stick with it. And, again, why I really appreciate the breaking this into quadrants and trying to unpack. And I'm sorry for saying the obvious, but, this just brings home to me the need for us to be really analytical and thinking through, if this is the way we've always done it, what is the impact on students, and how do we need to change so we're not harming our students, but we are meeting our other goals. So just to add to the chair's categories, ensuring that, we're not just doing something because we've always done it. We're not continuing to do something just because we've always done it in the past.
Thank you, Ms. Victor. Mr. Irish?
Just a quick follow-up to the joint scenario, and I hate to use it that bluntly, and Javier just pulled out the policy mentioning the word shall, and I'm just curious whether or not shall was born out of previous school board policy, or is it in consultation with our legal counsel, such that possession is, I assume, against the law?
That's a good question. I suspect it definitely is in board policy. This policy was last revised in adopted in 1984, last revised in 2013. I also, I suspect that it is probably born from the fact that it is considered a violation of law, and there are potentially, I'm trying to think, I'm not 100% sure of this, but there has been a time when there are federal expectations associated with that type of reporting, tied to federal grants and things along those lines. So if you receive federal funding, you have to report, violations of, So, and, I think to Dr. Ahmed's point, I think that staff uses a more sort of therapeutic lens in approaching this and thinking about whether this is a chronic and,
if I could just interject just for real quickly, I understand where you're going with this. I don't think that, I think judgment rules the day in these scenarios. And I understand that there's a big difference between the left quadrant and the right quadrant with respect to, my only point was whether or not the term shall was inserted based on counsel, or so it's just something to think about as we redraft.
Yep, absolutely.
Let me see. Ms. Russell Better?
And so can I just add to this list of, sort of categorizations? I think, Mr. Irish's point is, is it legally, and I think Jake had framed that more elegantly in his first, in his very first, sort of principle, but something along the lines of, are we legally obligated to do it?
All right. Aura, was your hand up, or was that from earlier?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a thought I wanted to share just after Ms. Vigdor shared some of her thinking. I just was thinking about some of the work we did in our Race in America work together, and I just wanted to share, like, remember the article? I think it was Paul Gorski, the how trauma informed are we really? And I just feel like that language is helping me right now, just thinking about, sort of the traditional idea that being trauma informed is looking at what's happening, in kids' lives out in their families and homes. And I just think, I hope that what we can do here is really be thinking, which is I think what we're doing, is looking at this, like, how are we in our school buildings, right? With these policies, creating or hopefully looking at not creating further trauma within our buildings. So I guess I just wanted to throw that language out there because I thought that was so dynamic when we were doing that reading and learning together. So.
Thank you. I guess as I'm looking, I don't know, I found that it is helpful to find these subcategories. We started heading in that direction, so I'm going to carry that forward even further. The JCCO interaction, how will we categorize that? It needs to happen in the greater scheme of things because there's an obligation, right? But does it need to happen in school? I think was the greater question. And then I think we've talked also about, are the students and families aware of their legal options? Whether, how those, and those are things that might not be our obligation to have that, but we definitely might have that in our checklist of making sure that's been done. So I guess that category would be, has to happen. Our policies should reflect whether it should happen in school. And then does it happening in school become beneficial or harmful to the student? And I think that's ultimately what the quadrant was trying to achieve. Good. So within those categories, Superintendent and Aaron, is it helpful then to break down the policies on those categories, or how do we find these subcategories helpful? I don't want to keep going down that route if it takes us to another quadrant image.
I find it helpful. I think it might be helpful for me to try to summarize some of the categorizations or, sort of evolving lenses, I guess, for looking at these policies. From what I've heard, one is this, notion of whether it's a response to an actual event versus a anticipation of the possibility of an event. And I think that's the sort of, somebody has a joint versus we have cops at the dams because somebody may have a joint. So I think that's one of the sort of lenses that I think are emerging. And I'm staying away from calling them principles at this point because they're not really principles. They're more sort of like, I can't come up with a better word than lens. One is, is it something that we're legally obligated to do? I think that is, as clear cut as it gets. If, there's a law that says that somebody who has a firearm has to be reported to the police, somebody who has a firearm has to be reported to the police. So we don't have a lot of wiggle room in those. And I think that is an important filter lens for analyzing this. I think, this is, Aura's member Russell Better's, the filter or lens of, are we creating trauma by virtue of, having, an interaction with the police? So I think that is, a lens that we should be bringing to this. I think Roberto you framed it as, you know, does it need to happen in school? Is it something that, you know, it needs to happen somewhere, but does it need to happen in school? So is school the place, the best place for this interaction to occur? Which is, you know, like doing research on policing is something that the answer to that is probably yes. You know, that is a police officer coming into school and helping a student, or a student, you know, going with a police officer in an internship or something along those lines, you know. But is it the best place for a JCCO check-in to occur? That's something that we should analyze and, you know, take a position on as we develop our policies. So, you know, is the school the best place for this interaction to occur? I think there's one around whether it's in this might be in that same context, whether it's voluntary or compelled. So, you know, is it something that the student or the student's parents or both, you know, have agreed to, versus it's something that we are compelling or somebody else is compelling without having, you know, sort of an agreement, a pre-agreement to that engagement. And then I think the one that Emily articulated is, you know, to question these from the lens of, is this just because we've always done it this way and we always, you know, and I think that applies to things like the dance and things along those lines. We've always done it, so we just continue to do it without questioning whether it makes sense for us to continue to do that, and, you know, weighing the potential or looking at the examples of the places where it doesn't happen and what are the implications of it not happening in those places. So I think that that's the other, you know, sort of the other lens that you know, that I've taken away from this conversation so far. So are there other things like that? Because I think, you know, ultimately what we want to do is then we want to be able to look at our policies through those multiple lenses and redraft them with an understanding of what the implications are if you're applying the voluntary versus compelled lens, or the we've always done it this way before, or the we're legally required to do it lens.
I also heard Dr. Ahmed distinguish between disciplinary and therapeutic remedies. And there's also something about noticing when we're outsourcing work that we could do, outsourcing it to law enforcement, and that we could do from our professional perspective.
Yeah.
Mr. Irish?
Just tagging on what Jake just mentioned, with respect to school dances and that kind of atmosphere, are we in concert with the PEA or volunteers? And I'm not saying are we, but should we consider those who are hosting that event, absent law enforcement? Are they going to be comfortable in that environment with that responsibility? Whether it becomes physical and I think Ora had mentioned in the very beginning about de-escalation techniques, and whether or not we want to incorporate that into staff that are associated with those events. So just a thought.
Yeah. I think, you know, you can look at that through the, you know, outsourcing of obligations lens, and, you know, and arrive at a different, you know, at a different set of conclusions based on looking at it from that angle versus the, you know, we've always done it that way. So I think that's a helpful example.
Is the truant student another one of those examples where we will call for like a check-in? We'll ask the cops to do that, but we could, and I know we do it because I know staff members would go to a family's house and check in. Okay, so that would be another outsourcing example.
Yeah.
That's also one about whether it's legally, whether we're compelled, I mean, there's statutory language around the truancy protocols. But,
what's the truancy age in Maine?
I mean, it starts with compulsory education. So you exit out of truancy after 17. So it's up to 17.
That's what I meant. I'm sorry. I didn't know how to ask that.
Yeah. I had one other that I think was said in there, but I know it'll come up in the policy, and I think it centers for me around like likely the subject of investigation or witness of an investigation, and I think it maybe was said in some ways, but was more around like the mentorship, but just like the level of informed consent might be a framing around that, like if, because it has happened, right? And, this is a bit more in the reactive zone as well, that like there's an active investigation and they come and they want to interview X, Y, or Z student, right? And what are the parameters around that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Aaron, because that one's down the middle. And it also caught my eye because like in investigations, on an incident that happened in school versus, we heard that Johnny was, hanging out with Billy over at so-and-so last weekend. Johnny and Billy are endearing. Let's go check out. So that's a very different situation. And so in that one, that's more of we're just here, providing instruction as good instructors and students are attending, and then knock, knock, police show up. That's different, right? Would that happen? What does our policy say that we should do if a police officer comes knocking at the door?
What was happening in the past with having an SRO was that little Johnny feels like lollipop or chocolate from.
I think your microphone got
like young men or young women steal something from CVS, and with the camera and the police alerted, they will send the pictures to the SRO in the school, and then here we have someone who said like, John, come out of the class, and the SRO will say like, you were there, and then write all this citing and the court appointment and all that stuff. So that was happening with the SRO presence in the school.
And in the non-SRO schools, like in a middle school?
Yeah, I've had that. The police will come with security footage and ask if we'll cooperate or not.
So policy KI, which you should be able to see right now, speaks to that.
Is it possible to close up a little more?
To what?
To enlarge the text a little.
Yes.
It's also in the summary of policies. It's not the exact specific language, but there's a summary that's that's in the packet.
Thank you. That's better.
So I guess what I'm trying to get at, again, I'm not sure if it's helpful to do, is in which category does this land? Because we didn't initiate contact. We're quote unquote innocent bystanders here. So this is a need to happen, but does it need to happen in school? Question mark. Because we could potentially say, have a policy that says that, I mean, I don't know. Actually, we would need, this is obviously one that we need to see what our legal obligation is. I'm sorry, I completely missed that.
Yeah. And I don't, I think it's helpful to sort of grapple with it in specific examples. And, I think we're not going to be rewriting the policies tonight. So I think it's really trying to sort of give us the lenses and the frames through which we can look at those and then, engage in the writing process. But I think this exercise is a formative one for us to sort of ground in, sort of the reality of any policy making, which is you're balancing interests and, making decisions based on the values that you hold, that are, that's how you're prioritizing those.
Yeah, Ms. Rosa-Better, go ahead. I'll share. I'll wait to group my thoughts together before I share them.
Oh, thank you. I just was wondering, my question in response to what Dr. Ahmed shared about the example of, a student being on video, and then but then because I was just wondering, this piece about law enforcement personnel may interview a student on school grounds without the prior permission, and then those criteria, was that at all different with there being an SRO in the building versus an officer outside as far as following that? Like, was that a norm that they would be stating in writing and all of that, the employee being present? Like, has that been a norm?
That's what our policy calls for. And,
Okay, so the SRO part wasn't different then. I mean, I just wondered with that relationship, was any of that considered different? I mean, it was still a law enforcement.
There's no policy exception here that says that it's different for an SRO, but I do think that this is, sort of one of the underlying tensions around the SRO is that when the SRO becomes a part of the building, you are less likely to ask for, something in writing that says that you tried to contact the parents and the parents said yes, or, the parents were not available, and you just, you don't question those things at the same level that you might for somebody. But I also will say that this is a policy that, that it has not been well understood or followed regularly within our schools. And, that is to, somebody said this earlier, sort of our level of comfort with, the police being in our lives in a way that, that is not required by law and is actually prohibited by policy, and yet we've done it.
Okay, and then number 3, I mean, I'm glad that's in there and would hope that now that would be the case, but with an SRO, do they think of themselves as a school employee? And that was, so I guess, I would just, I think teasing that out, I guess now without the SRO, it's a moot point now, but
our SRO policy was explicit about the fact that they were not school employees, but again, it's not whether it was in policy
how it was followed.
Employees, right. It was by virtue of proximity and comfort that they operated de facto as school employees.
Okay, thank you.
This is only a bit related to this, but just the other implication around some of this discussion is the students' records policy, which indicates that the designation of Portland Police, and we've just had managed a recent situation where they are designated as our law enforcement authority or whatever. I forget the exact language there, but which means we can share student information without parent consent. With them directly. So that's another one that's just kind of in this ballpark that will be kind of for consideration. I'm wondering a little bit just in terms of timing, given this, that like the approach, given these lenses, it would be, I guess, so let me say what I had been anticipating and then can get feedback from the committee around whether this is appropriate, was kind of from this conversation bringing forward proposed revisions for the group to, for the committee to then review and discuss and analyze based on these lenses. I guess I want to acknowledge in that means there'll be some level of assertion, right? Potentially around whether if there's a proposed change or not to the existing language in that version of it. That's how I had been imagining us proceeding following this conversation. I guess an alternative one that makes me a little, or I think that is potentially most efficient just in terms of committee time and versus, I guess, an alternative, maybe there's another one, is, the committee kind of working through each of these policies to collaboratively propose revisions. I guess my worry on that in terms of efficiency is just that seems like that would be, given the number of policies we have that implicate law enforcement, that seems like that could take a significant amount of time. And that, again, those may not be the only two options, but I had come into this with the assumption that, these lenses and, would give us enough direction, which I would feel comfortable, I think, based on this conversation, making an initial effort at, right? But
I think it's the former and not the latter for the reasons that you described. But I also think that, as staff, that we can be explicit about how we approached it using these lenses. So I sort of envision, for the redraft of those policies, sort of a checklist, if you will, as to whether it was, legally obligated, whether we considered that it was the best place for, that schools were the best place for this interaction to occur, and whether it was, because we thought it was, as a matter of principle, in reactive situations, we want to engage the police, but in situations where we are being preventative, we don't want to engage the police. So I think that that's where I think we can use these lenses then to be able to analyze and justify the revisions that we propose to the school board.
I like that, and that's the way that I kept referring to them as subcategories, but the lenses, or we said we didn't feel comfortable saying principles, but that's very much the way that I envision it happening. You said checklist a moment ago, and in essence, that's because you trickle down eventually to the point where, as we said initially, some of these there is no alternative. We're legally obligated to do it. And then when there's an option, that's really where the substantive discussion should be. So I personally would appreciate getting, based on those subcategories, recommendations from staff, and then taking the policy from there, and taking the policy committee from there. Anyone else? Aura or Jeff, anything else?
No, that sounds good to me.
I think that falls in line with the focus group. So I'd be all on board with that.
Thank you for saying that, Jeff. That's another good alignment. Also, this reflects what the focus group also have brought up. So can you, Javier, do you mind just one last time tell us briefly what you have so far as those ways to break it down, so we can.
I'm gonna ask Anne. I don't know if you've captured those, so that because I'm looking at my notes, and I also know that I didn't follow my notes religiously, so I may have. So if you captured them and you want to read them back, that would be awesome. And if not, I will try to reconstruct my thinking.
I did. What I have is, do interactions need to happen in schools? Is law enforcement preemptive or reactionary? Is it something that the district is legally obligated to do? Are we creating trauma? Is it voluntary or compelled? Is this just because we have always done it this way? Is it disciplinary or therapeutic? Are we outsourcing work that we could do? Are all parties comfortable with the absence of law enforcement at events? And are staff trained in de-escalation?
I like that list. What do you guys think?
Solid start.
Great. So it looks like we have thumbs up, like we're good. Excellent. Great notes, and awesome. Yeah.
She's brilliant.
She really is. Phenomenal work. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So, do we need to keep sharing, or can we come back and we're supposed to go through 8, or assuming to 8, or was 7:30 our time?
7:30 is officially our time, and it would be great if we could revisit the minutes before we adjourn.
Thank you, Anne, for reminding us. So do we have enough feedback and input from us on that piece? Excellent. So we'll close our discussion on the law enforcement policy revision work. Thank you, everyone. I thought that was really productive use of our time. I like what we've laid down for our next steps as well. So let's go back to the minutes. We had Jeff, before you had connectivity issues. We were about to approve our minutes, and so I'll start over. If we can get a motion for the approval of the minutes of March 23rd, 2021. Aura, and then second by
Second.
the Irish. Any questions in the minutes? Seeing none. We do now have a person in the list of attendees, so I'll ask if there's any public comment on the minutes of March 23rd, 2021. And I don't see any hands raised from our one loyal attendee. And so I will bring it back. If there's any committee discussion, we'll entertain it. Otherwise, all those in favor of approving the minutes, please indicate. And if we can do just a verbal. Ms. Rosalbatter?
Yes.
And Mr. Irish?
Yes.
I'm a yes as well, and that's unanimous. Great. Do we have any other points of discussion? Okay, then we'll entertain a motion to adjourn our meeting.
Have to get used to the language
Yeah,
here, Chair.
Yeah.
Help me out. What are the different things I can say? Right? So,
Be creative. Be creative.
what's that? Be creative? That's why I quietly just went.
I'm going to second whatever Aura says.
There you go. All right, and so we've adjourned at 7:36 p.m. Thank you all for your work tonight. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Good
Right.
night.
Good night. Thank you all.